My name is Quinn Ceilly, and I'm an undergraduate student at SUNY Oswego. I am a psychology and cognitive science double major, and I've always been fascinated by the human mind and its remarkable capabilities. My honors thesis will be exploring mental capabilities and abnormalities, specifically delving into potential interrelations between the facets of intelligence, anxiety, overthinking, rumination, and physiological manifestations of stress. This presentation outlines relevant information from the literature, describes the proposed experiment's rationale, and later introduces planned methods. Experimentation is expected to begin in the fall of 2021, while data analysis will likely take place in 2022. In order for human beings to survive in a dynamic environment, it is necessary to maintain internal consistency, or homeostasis, as often as possible. Stress refers to outcomes associated with stimuli that endanger internal balance in an organism, in which the stressor defines the perceived or existing threat, and the stress response defines the reaction to the encountered stressor. While stress responses have historically served as adaptive mechanisms in survival, experiencing extreme long-term stress responses may produce physiological and mental health complications. As such, psychosomatic illness is defined as any physiological or medical condition that is influenced by psychosocial elements in its onset or progression, and that elicits biological and operative damage in the body. These conditions include autonomic nervous abnormalities, irritable bowel syndrome, essential hypertension, and hyperventilation, in addition to cardiovascular disease, upper respiratory diseases, and autoimmune and inflammatory diseases. Psychosocial stress-related symptoms frequently are transitory in nature and can be overcome when the stress is alleviated. But when these experienced stressors are severe, frequent, and long-lasting, physiological illnesses can result. This visual shows a few general types of stress responses. While positive stress responses are frequently evolutionarily beneficial, tolerable stress responses elicit a more intense, potentially damaging response, and toxic responses have the highest potential for negative psychological and physiological outcomes. As such, psychosocial stressors can have considerable impact on mood, well-being, behavior, and health. While acute stress responses in young or otherwise healthy individuals may be adaptive and less detrimental to overall health, these stressors can elicit more negative long-term outcomes, particularly in older or unhealthy individuals. Even otherwise modest stressors can lead to a higher likelihood of psychosomatic illness in individuals who are more susceptible to stress due to prior experience and character traits, such as an individual's ability to adapt under adverse circumstances. These outcomes are impacted by the character, amount, and persistence of experienced stressors, in addition to influences such as the individual's genetic, hereditary, and constitutional considerations, psychosocial factors, and acquired coping responses. In addition to psychosomatic illness, overthinking tendency, ruminative behavior, and intelligence will be investigated as potential influencing factors. Overthinking processes encompass both worry and rumination, and worrying and ruminative behaviors together have been shown to be chronic occurrences, involve a loss of control, the occurrence of intrusive thoughts, repetitive negative thinking, and a fear of the unknown. While worry is often directed at future uncontrollable events and potential obstacles, rumination frequently occurs in response to previously experienced events. More specifically, rumination is characterized by a recurrent consideration of emotions and their source, and the contemplation of all possible negative outcomes in response to adverse feelings and emotions. So the big difference here is focusing on the past versus the future. While prior research findings have indicated that anxiety and depressive symptomatology correlate negatively with measures of intelligence, more recent studies have found potential positive associations between generalized anxiety disorder, worrying tendency, and intelligence. Penny and colleagues specifically examined the role of intelligence in worrying and ruminative behavior, in which intelligence was determined to be positively associated with cognitive processes involved in worry and rumination characteristics often present in anxiety and depressive symptomatology. In addition, Karpinski and colleagues investigated high intelligence and its potential for exaggerated psychological and physiological overexcitabilities. And overexcitabilities are exaggerated responses or hyperreactions that have been shown to occur more often and reach greater intensities in individuals of higher intelligence. These are intensified experiences and emotional responses to stimuli that have the potential to generate neuroses, such as anxiety, depression, worry, and rumination. These concepts and potential associations are well represented in Figure 1. Here we can more clearly see how all of these variables can be interrelated. As shown in this schematic, hyperbrain refers to the high cognitive or intellectual capacity that accompanies high intelligence in a broad sense, while hyperbody refers to the physiological and psychological manifestations that can ensue. Individuals who are identified as having high intellectual capacity or hyperbrain have been shown to exhibit overexcitabilities in certain areas that may make them more vulnerable to various psychological disorders and physiological conditions, such as intensified sensory and modified immune and inflammatory responses, which refers to hyperbody, which is on the right side of the schematic, with hyperbrain and associated information on the left side. Further, worry has been identified as a common cognitive process present in individuals diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, in which more frequent and intense worrying behaviors are associated with higher intelligence test scores. Karpinski and colleagues define psychoneuroimmunology as a consideration of how stress responses to environmental stimuli, specifically persistent responses, impact the mechanisms involved in brain and immune system communication pathways. These researchers examined psychoneuroimmunological processes in participants at or exceeding the 98th percentile of intelligence. Participants self-reported diagnosed and speculated mood and anxiety disorders, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and physiological conditions such as environmental and food allergies, asthma, and autoimmune diseases. Concerning all components of their study as a whole, results indicated high statistical significance and relative risk ratios for all conditions and diagnoses investigated, verifying the hypothesized claim that individuals with high IQ were more susceptible to the diagnosis of affective disorders, ADHD, ASD, and physiological diseases. Karpinski and colleagues' findings concerning the mean prevalence of anxiety disorders in individuals at high intelligence is shown specifically here in Figure 2. In this figure, the mean prevalence comparisons are illustrated between the high intelligence sample and the national average for generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Significant increases in prevalence were determined between the GAD and OCD conditions for those with high intelligence, while significant differences in clinical diagnoses for social anxiety were not found between those of high intelligence and the national average. A significant increase in prevalence was apparent when self-diagnosed individuals were included. Overall, while intelligence has been found to elicit both psychological and physiological consequences, mixed results present in the literature indicate a need for more extensive research in the investigation of these topics. Further, less research exists in other areas of intelligence beyond IQ investigation, together with the influence of anxiety, overthinking, and rumination, which the proposed study hopes to further investigate. Ultimately, this research project will examine how mental capabilities, or differing features of intelligence, and abnormalities, such as anxiety, overthinking, and rumination, are interrelated, and how they factor into physiological bodily responses, such as heart rate, upset stomach, headache, and dizziness, for example. The existence of individual variations in these components of mental functioning, behavior, and baseline stress level will also be considered. This proposed research project is aimed at examining mental capability and abnormality, intelligence, overthinking and ruminative tendencies, and physiological aspects of stress and anxiety. It sets out to investigate why individuals experience variations in baseline stress level, anxiety, and overthinking and rumination, and how these characteristics can be realized physiologically. The following research questions will be explored. Why do some individuals more readily experience shortness of breath, lightheadedness, upset stomach, increased heart rate, and a heightened fight or flight response in certain contexts? How are intelligence, anxiety, and overthinking and rumination interrelated? Overall, the proposed study will examine these questions, considering how and why these abnormalities arise, and why physiological symptoms of stress affect some more severely than others. Outlined below are two major hypotheses of interest. Individuals who report higher levels of anxiety will report greater overthinking and rumination tendencies and will experience higher levels of physiological stress, both in the physiological stress response measure and in the self-report measure. Individuals who score higher on the intelligence measure will experience higher levels of anxiety, greater overthinking tendencies, and greater rumination tendencies. SUNY Oswego College students approximately 18 to 26 years of age will be recruited via advertisements and flyers posted around campus and through the SONA Psychology Student Research Participation software tool and in the Campus Health Center. Both healthy controls and individuals who experience anxiety, overthinking, and rumination will be encouraged to participate. The planned study will use an experimental design that is paired with interview and self-report measures in young adults. Following initial screening procedures, a language-based test will be administered to assess intelligence. And physiological measures of stress reactivity will be collected through the utilization of the BioPack laboratory device, which is located in Dr. Lee Bacher's research lab. An anxiety questionnaire will also be given. Following baseline measurements, background questions concerning individual influences on stress level, and the collection of health and fitness information, participants will be exposed to a series of stressors and physiological responses such as heart rate variability will be measured. The extent to which overthinking and rumination occur during and after completing a frustration task will also be considered. And due to the requirement that participants undergo modest stressor tasks, a frustration task, and wear sensors during the experimental procedure, each participant will receive $5 in compensation for the cooperation and their time as a means of incentivizing participation. As the literature search process is continued and as variable measures are solidified, ethically appropriate means to introduce modest stressors and frustration tasks will be determined. Figure 3 shows some of the numerous physiological measurements that can be performed with the BioPack device that is anticipated to be used. And some of these include heart rate variability, muscle activity, brain activity, and skin conductance, in addition to others. And then this study specifically plans to utilize heart rate variability measures. And finally, Figure 4 shows some additional measurements and their associated relevance and experimentation. Finally, here are my references. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to viewing other students' work.